The straw on the floor has not been fully replaced in longer than anyone can remember. New straw has been layered on top of old straw, which rests on top of older straw still, and beneath that lowest layer, a quiet decomposition has been underway for months or years. Rotting cabbage scraps, fish bones, dried vomit, animal dung, dead beetles, and the accumulated biological residue of an entire family living, eating, sleeping, and dying in a single room. Children crawl across this surface. Infants press their faces into it. A visitor entering for the first time described the smell as something close to a barnyard grave. Nobody inside the house found this remarkable. Nobody found it unusual. Because in 13th century England, this was not poverty. This was simply home. If a person had been born in England in the 1200s, the probability that they would spend their entire existence working the land stood at roughly 80%. Not in London, not within sight of a castle or a cathedral, not anywhere near a bathhouse, a paved road, or a physician. The overwhelming majority of the English population lived in villages, in houses built from sticks, straw, and mud, sharing a single room with their families, and, depending on the season, their livestock. The floor was beaten earth, the walls were woven twigs, a lattice of hazel or willow called wattle, smeared with daub, a mixture of wet clay, chopped straw, and animal dung that dried into a rough, cracking surface. Windows, if they existed at all, were open holes in the wall, perhaps covered by a wooden shutter in more prosperous households. Glass was a material reserved for churches and manor houses. Ventilation, in any meaningful sense, did not exist, and in the center of that room, burning almost every hour of every day, sat a fire that filled the home with smoke, because there was no chimney to carry it away. The smoke rose through the thatch above and filtered slowly into the sky, leaving everything it touched, food, clothing, skin, hair, bedding, walls coated in soot, and permeated with the permanent, inescapable smell of burning. One historian described these dwellings with a precision that reads almost like an apology. Peasant houses were small, dark, and cramped, with little in the way of ventilation or sanitation, and yet they were also the center of family life, where meals were cooked and eaten, and children were raised. That assessment is generous, because what it describes in clinical terms is a room roughly 15 feet by 12, filled with wood smoke, occupied by animals and parasites, and inhabited by an entire family attempting to survive another English winter on a diet of dark bread, thin stew, and ale brewed from water drawn uncomfortably close to the cesspit. The day begins the way every day begins in this world, which is to say it begins badly. The body wakes on a straw mattress lying directly on the beaten earth floor, surrounded by every member of the household in a single shared bed. The sleeping arrangement followed a specific and consistent order documented across the period. The married couple occupied the center. Daughters slept nearest the wall with the youngest positioned closest to her mother, and sons arranged themselves on the opposite side in descending order of age. Everyone touching, everyone breathing the same heavy, smoke-laden air, everyone sharing the same vermin. The straw inside that mattress has not been changed since the last harvest. That is not rhetorical exaggeration. According to surviving household records, mattress stuffing was typically replaced once a year during autumn harvest season, when an abundance of fresh material happened to be available. King Henry VIII, centuries later, had his straw mattress changed daily. The peasant sleeping on this floor in 1230 is not Henry VIII. This mattress is a breeding colony. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs had established themselves as permanent residents of medieval bedding, and most people accepted their presence as an unavoidable feature of sleep. Some households attempted resistance. They mixed dried herbs into the straw, basil, chamomile, lavender, and mint, hoping the scent would repel the parasites. According to a 14th century household manual called Le Ménagier de Paris, it was the wife's duty to ensure there were no fleas in the marital bed. The same text recommended scattering alder leaves around the room, using white bedding on which parasites were more easily visible, and, in a stroke of desperate medieval engineering, placing a slice of bread coated in glue with a candle stuck in its center as a flea trap. The principle held that fleas, attracted to the warmth of the flame, would hop onto the bread and become stuck. Whether this device achieved meaningful results is debatable. What is not debatable is that people were desperate enough to construct it, deploy it, and document it for the instruction of future households. The body peels itself from the straw, and the first conscious act of the day is scratching. Everyone scratches. Lice were so universal in medieval life that their removal had been elevated to the status of a social activity. One peasant woman from southern France recalled watching two of her neighbors sitting in the afternoon sun on their rooftops while their daughters picked lice from their hair. It was bonding. It was routine. It was also completely futile, because the lice returned every single night from the same bedding, the same clothing, and the same unwashed surroundings that had produced them in the first place. Even the highest ranks of English society could not escape infestation. Servants testified that one prominent churchman's clothing held as many lice as a man could carry in his hand. Old garments donated to the poor had to be deloused before distribution. Even people desperate enough to accept charity would not take clothing that arrived visibly infested. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, was discovered after his murder in 1170 wearing underclothes that were, according to the monks who prepared his body, crawling with vermin. A German prior writing in the early 13th century worried openly that lice visible in the brethren's robes would frighten away potential recruits to the monastic life. These were not peasants huddled in mud huts. These were bishops, archbishops, and monks occupying the finest accommodations medieval England could provide. And they were covered in lice. The reason nobody could win this war is that nobody understood what they were fighting. The dominant medical theory of the period, inherited from classical antiquity and refined by Islamic physicians before reaching Western Europe, held that parasites were generated spontaneously from filth, or more precisely, from an imbalance of the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. One physician described the louse as something that emerged from putrescence at the edge of a person's pores. The body, according to this framework, manufactured its own parasites because something within it had fallen out of equilibrium. This belief persisted in Western medicine until the 17th century. 400 years of scratching, 400 years of herbal powders, mercury-laced treatments, bread and glue flea traps, and alder leaves scattered across floors. And not once during that span did anyone think to blame the straw. The one-room house is now awake. The fire in the central hearth has been burning through the night, kept alive under a layer of banked ashes because relighting it in the morning, striking flint, catching a spark, nursing it through tinder, was substantially harder than simply maintaining the embers. The smoke from that fire has nowhere to travel except upward through the thatch roof, and on its way there it passes through every cubic inch of breathable air in the home. Modern researchers who have studied reconstructed medieval dwellings have compared the indoor air quality to sitting in a room filled with second-hand cigarette smoke every day for the duration of a human life. People who have spent time in these reconstructed cottages report that wood smoke permanently saturates wool, hair, skin, and cloth within hours. The smell does not wash out, it does not fade, it becomes part of the person. In 13th century England, one did not merely live with smoke, one wore it. The smell was embedded in clothing, baked into food, layered into the thatch, absorbed by the walls, and deposited deep in the lungs with every breath drawn indoors. This constant smoldering fire also meant that the medieval home existed in a state of permanent proximity to catastrophe. Surviving records describe chickens igniting loose straw on the floor, candles toppling into bedding, children being scolded by open cooking pots balanced on the hearth, and sparks from the fire catching the thatch overhead. One careless moment, one gust of wind through the open window hole, and the entire structure, sticks, straw, daub, thatch, and everything inside it, could be engulfed within minutes. The morning hygiene routine that follows might surprise a modern observer, because it does exist. The popular image of medieval peasants as people who never washed is largely a myth generated by later centuries. Washing the hands and face each morning was normal practice across most social classes in 13th century England. Soap had been available for centuries, manufactured from rendered animal fat combined with wood ash, and sometimes scented with dried herbs. Medical writers of the period recommended cleaning the teeth with herbal powders and rinsing the mouth upon waking. Public bathhouses operated in cities across medieval Europe. Paris maintained dozens. London supported a significant number. Southwark offered hot baths. Street criers walked through neighborhoods, announcing when the water was heated and ready. Saturday was a favored bathing day across much of the population. But the peasant in this story does not live in London or Paris or Southwark. This peasant lives in a village. The bath, if one is taken, consists of a wooden tub or half-barrel filled with a modest quantity of water heated laboriously over the hearth fire. More commonly, a jug of water poured over the body served as the extent of the washing. Most people made do with a quick scrub from a basin. Medieval people washed. They cared about cleanliness. They were not indifferent to filth. But caring about cleanliness and achieving it are fundamentally different propositions when the entire physical infrastructure of daily life works against the effort. The clothes still smell of smoke within minutes of being put on. The bedding still harbors fleas regardless of which herbs have been pressed into the straw. The house has no ventilation beyond the holes in its walls, and the water used for washing was drawn from the same well or stream that sits in dangerous proximity to the cesspit and the grazing animals. If you are finding this documentary illuminating, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who values history told without romantic distortion. These are the stories that survive in archaeological evidence and primary sources long after popular myth has replaced them with something more comfortable. The subject of food requires its own reckoning. Breakfast, to the extent that the term applies, centers on bread and pottage. Pottage is a thick, slow-cooked stew made from whatever vegetables the household garden has produced: cabbage, leeks, onions, peas, or beans, sometimes enriched with scraps of beef or mutton if the family could afford animal protein. Chemical analysis of pottery fragments recovered from medieval village sites confirms that these stews constituted the absolute mainstay of the peasant diet, with dairy products, particularly soft cheeses made from ewes or cow's milk, also playing a significant nutritional role. The bread consumed alongside the pottage bears no resemblance to any modern loaf. It is dense, dark, and heavy, made from barley or rye because wheat flour was largely a luxury reserved for wealthier tables. Following a poor harvest, the grain was stretched with ground acorns, dried beans, and peas, anything that could add bulk to the flour and produce a loaf that would sustain the body through another day of labor. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which killed an estimated 10 to 15% of England's population, peasants were driven to eat the seed grain they had set aside for the following spring's planting. The consequences cascaded forward into the next growing season with devastating results, extending a one-year disaster into a multi-year catastrophe that left survivors physically and psychologically scarred for the remainder of their lives. One detail of the bread economy stings with particular sharpness. Peasants in 13th century England were not permitted to bake their own bread. Feudal obligation required them to use the lord of the manor's communal oven and pay a fee for the privilege. The lord's mill ground their grain, and the lord's oven baked their loaves, and at every stage a portion was extracted as payment. The peasant who grew the wheat, harvested it by hand, carried it to the mill, and waited for his flour could not take it home and bake it over his own fire. He paid someone else for the right to eat what he had grown. The absence of certain foods from this table carries its own historical weight. There are no potatoes, no tomatoes, no chili peppers, no maize, no chocolate, no coffee, no tea. None of these existed in the European diet before 1492. The caloric requirements of a hard-laboring adult male in this period, roughly 2,900 calories per day according to modern nutritional estimates, had to be met almost entirely by bread, pottage, cheese, ale, and whatever the household's small garden and animals could provide. Monks in wealthy abbeys, by contrast, sometimes consumed 6,000 calories per day according to dietary reconstructions based on surviving kitchen accounts. More than twice what a peasant needed. Certainly more than twice what a peasant received. Obesity and arthritis were documented conditions in medieval monasteries. The peasant household did not face that particular problem. What the household drank mattered at least as much as what it ate, because the water could kill with a speed and certainty that bad bread could not match. Rivers and wells served simultaneously as drinking sources and dumping grounds for waste, animal carcasses, and cesspit overflow. Urban records from later medieval London describe watercourses blocked with filth and generating stenches that drove residents from their homes. In the village, the scale was smaller. The principle was identical. The household well sat near the household cesspit. The animals grazed near the water source. The runoff from one contaminated the other with a regularity that no one in the 13th century could see, measure, or understand. The practical solution, and it was a genuine one grounded in observable results even if the underlying science remained unknown, was ale. Villagers across all social classes drank ale because the brewing process required boiling the water, which killed waterborne pathogens and rendered the liquid substantially safer than drinking it raw. Cider played a regional role in apple-growing counties. Wine belonged almost exclusively to the wealthy and the church. The peasant drank ale with breakfast, with meals, and through the working day, not because medieval people were habitual drunkards, but because the alternative was dysentery, and dysentery killed. The subject that every account of medieval domestic life eventually reaches, and that no modern reader approaches without dread, is the toilet. The household toilet in a 13th century English village is a cesspit dug at the back of the yard, perhaps covered by a small wooden hut with a bench and a hole cut into it, if the family possesses the resources and motivation to construct one. If the family does not, the facility is simply the hole. At night, a chamber pot serves the purpose, and its contents are emptied into the pit each morning. The cleaning materials available after use consist of moss, hay, dried leaves, rags, or whatever happens to be within reach. Those are the options. The cesspit generates a permanent stench that pervades the yard and, depending on wind direction, the interior of the house itself. When solid waste accumulates beyond the pit's capacity, it must be excavated, a task performed every few years and requiring several men working in coordinated misery. One man stood in the waste itself, shoveling it into buckets. Another hauled the filled buckets up by rope. Others carried the loads to a cart for disposal outside the settlement. The men who performed this work were called gong farmers, and according to surviving payment records, they could earn in a single night what other laborers earned in a week. The compensation reflected the danger. Cesspits collapsed without warning, burying workers alive. Accumulated gases, methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, could suffocate a man in seconds. And some workers simply fell through the surface crust and drowned in the waste below. According to coroner's records, a man named Richard the Raker died exactly this way, falling through the rotted planking of a privy and suffocating in the accumulated filth beneath. More than a century earlier, a nobleman perished in similar fashion when a privy seat gave way beneath his weight during a council meeting. In at least one recorded siege, attackers breached a castle's defenses by climbing up through the latrine shaft, an entry point so foul that the defenders had apparently not considered it a vulnerability. The medieval toilet was not merely unpleasant, it was architecturally dangerous, occasionally lethal, and militarily exploitable. The word garderobe, used for the toilet facilities in castles and manor houses, translates literally as a place for guarding one's robes. People hung clothing near the privy shaft because the ammonia fumes rising from the accumulated waste below helped kill the lice embedded in the fabric. That practice represented one of the few anti-parasite strategies in the entire medieval period that had genuine chemistry behind it, even though the people employing it had no understanding of why it worked. They observed the result, fewer lice in clothing stored near the privy, and repeated the behavior. The mechanism remained invisible to them. In urban settings, the sanitation problem scaled upward into civic catastrophe. Late medieval London maintained only a small number of public latrines to serve tens of thousands of residents. One of these facilities held 128 seats in a single structure. Some districts became notorious for what contemporary documents described as the horrible atmosphere generated by common privies. Watercourses could no longer carry the volume of refuse being deposited in them. Houses near overwhelmed facilities became uninhabitable. Castles with dozens of garderobe chutes dumped their collective output into moats that became stagnant pools of sewage. Abandoned sites could accumulate mountains of waste that persisted for years. All of this, the cesspit overflow, the contaminated watercourses, the saturated soil, eventually made its way into the water people drank, the ground they grew food in, and the earth their children played on, completing a cycle of contamination that no one could see and no one could break. What was living inside the human body as a consequence of this cycle has been revealed with disturbing clarity by modern archaeology. Research conducted on medieval burial sites shows consistently high rates of intestinal parasite infection across the population. One study conducted at a Cambridge friary found that the monks buried there were more heavily infected with intestinal worms than the general townspeople buried at a nearby parish cemetery. The explanation is grim and elegant. The friars used human waste, their own and that of the surrounding community, to fertilize their monastery gardens. They grew vegetables in that enriched soil. They ate those vegetables, and they completed the parasite's reproductive cycle inside their own bodies, reinfecting themselves with every harvest. Researchers summarized the finding with stark directness: do not fertilize your lettuce with your own feces. According to archaeological evidence, between a quarter and a third of the medieval population may have carried intestinal worms at the time of their death. These were not microscopic organisms. Adult roundworms could grow to 30 centimeters in length. Whipworms measured several centimeters. Their eggs could survive in soil for months or years, waiting to be ingested by the next host. Nobody in the 13th century understood any of this. The dominant medical explanation held that intestinal worms, like external parasites, were generated spontaneously by an imbalance of the body's four humors. Treatments ranged from herbal preparations of questionable efficacy to concoctions containing genuinely toxic ingredients. The worms remained. They remained because the conditions that produced them, contaminated water, human waste fertilization, close cohabitation with animals, and total ignorance of the fecal-oral transmission route, remained unchanged for centuries. Beyond the parasites a person could feel, the diseases a person could not see permeated the 13th century environment with a thoroughness that modern epidemiology can only reconstruct in retrospect. Dysentery struck from contaminated water with devastating regularity. Tuberculosis spread through crowded, poorly ventilated rooms exactly like the one-room peasant house with its perpetual hearth fire and its absence of chimney or window glass. Ergotism, caused by a fungus that colonized rye grain in damp growing seasons, produced convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrene in the extremities, sometimes requiring amputation of fingers and toes that had turned black and died while still attached to the living body. Leprosy attacked the skin, nerves, and extremities, and those diagnosed with it faced not only physical deterioration, but social exile, forced into leper colonies, and required by law to announce their presence with a bell or clapper so that healthy people could avoid them. Sweating sickness killed quickly, unpredictably, and with a ferocity that terrified even physicians accustomed to high mortality. And above all of these, waiting in the near future like a wave already forming far out at sea, was plague. The Black Death would reach England's shores in the summer of 1348 and kill somewhere between 30 and 50% of the entire population. England's population, estimated at roughly 5 million in the year 1300, would fall to approximately half that number by 1400. The world that the people in this 13th century house inhabited was not merely difficult, it was a world perched on the edge of a demographic catastrophe that would reshape every institution, every economy, and every family on the island. Life expectancy figures for the period appear shockingly low. Estimates place life expectancy at birth in the range of 30 to 35 years. But that number, while accurate as a statistical average, is profoundly skewed by the rate of child death. According to demographic reconstructions, perhaps 30% of infants born in medieval England died within their first year. A significant proportion of those who survived infancy did not reach age 7. Boys were expected to begin working at 7 and could, under English law, be hanged for theft at that same age. Half the population was 21 years old or younger, but if a person survived, if they navigated the gauntlet of infancy, childhood disease, contaminated water, intestinal parasites, house fires, famine, and occupational injury, their actual remaining lifespan rose considerably. A person who reached adulthood in the 13th century was not guaranteed a short life. They were guaranteed a brutal opening passage through which an enormous percentage of their generation would not pass. Night falls on the 13th century English home. The fire is banked under its layer of ash to preserve the embers for morning. The single room darkens. The family settles back into the prescribed sleeping arrangement, parents in the center, daughters against the wall, sons on the far side, everyone pressed together for warmth in a house that has no heating system beyond the dying hearth and the body heat of the animals stabled at the far end of the same room. This biohouse design, in which humans and livestock shared a single structure under one continuous roof, became common across medieval England because it protected valuable animals during winter and provided a passive source of warmth for the family. It also meant that the household slept 15 feet from a cow, and that the sounds, smells, and biological outputs of the animals were an unbroken presence through every hour of sleep. Medieval literature described such peasant halls as places where the floor was so slimy a man could scarcely stand. That was the literary rendering. The physical reality was worse, because the literary rendering did not include the smell. Somewhere in the darkness, a flea finds exposed skin. The straw beneath the mattress rustles with movement that no one can identify, and no one attempts to investigate. The smoke from the dying fire sinks low and thickens as the thermal draft weakens. Outside, in the town's gong farmers are beginning their shift, lowering themselves by rope into cesspits, shoveling the accumulated waste of entire communities into buckets, hauling it upward one load at a time through the night air. In the village, the cesspit sits quietly at the edge of the yard, seeping its contents slowly into the surrounding soil, into the water table, into the well that will provide tomorrow morning's washing water and tomorrow's ale. A child turns in the shared bed. Surviving records tell of children dying in the street while relieving themselves, their deaths recorded with a brevity that suggests neither surprise nor particular grief. The cycle will begin again at dawn. The same straw, the same smoke, the same lice, the same bread baked in someone else's oven at someone else's price, the same pottage from the same garden growing in the same soil above the same seeping waste, the same water from the same contaminated source, the same parasites completing the same reproductive cycle through the same intestines, the same fire, banked and relit, filling the same room with the same smoke that coats the same lungs year after year until those lungs cannot function, or the thatch catches fire, or the water delivers dysentery, or the next famine arrives, or the plague finally crosses the channel and finds the door. This is what 24 hours looked like in a 13th century English home. The body woke covered in flea bites on a mattress that had not been changed in a year, in a room shared with family and livestock, breathing air that modern researchers have compared to chronic second-hand cigarette smoke exposure. The face and hands were washed, because medieval people were not indifferent to hygiene. They made soap from animal fat and ash, scrubbed their teeth with herbal powders, heated water when fuel could be spared, and picked lice from each other's hair in the afternoon sun as an act of care and community. The problem was never desire. The problem was never laziness or ignorance of the concept of cleanliness. The problem was that everything surrounding them, the water, the soil, the air, the walls, the bed, the food, the floor, was saturated with the very contaminants they were trying to wash away. They lived inside a closed loop of contamination that no herbal powder, no alder leaf, no bread and glue flea trap, and no Saturday bath could break, because the germ theory that would explain the loop was still 6 centuries in the future. The hand-washing that Ignaz Semmelweis would prove essential in 1847 was still an idea that would get a man committed to an asylum. The microscope that would reveal the organisms living in the water, the soil and the straw, was still an invention waiting to be born in a country that did not yet exist. The peasant standing in a 13th century English home, scrubbing soot from their hands with homemade soap, was doing everything they knew how to do. They were not ignorant, they were trapped inside a system whose invisible mechanics would not be understood for longer than the entire span of time that separated them from the Roman legions that had once occupied the same island. They could not see the bacteria in the water, they could not see the parasite eggs in the soil, they could not see the pathogens drifting in the smoke or breeding in the straw, or multiplying in the cesspit runoff that fed their well. They could only feel the consequences, the fevers, the worms, the rashes, the coughs, the children who did not survive their first winter, and reach for explanations that the science of their age could not provide. The 4 humors, spontaneous generation, divine punishment, bad air. The straw on the floor was never fully replaced, it was layered, and beneath it, in the compressed darkness where no light reached and no hand disturbed, the 13th century composted quietly, one season on top of another, waiting for a world that would not arrive for a very long time. If this documentary changed the way you understand medieval life, subscribe to this channel for more investigations into the darkest forgotten chapters of human history. The past was not a simpler time, it was a harder one, and the proof lies in every bone, every cesspit, every parasite egg preserved in the soil, and every floor that no one ever fully cleaned.